universe. This is quite wrong. In his model, time is definitely bounded in duration. So Davies concludes that recent ideas in quantum physics have changed our picture of the origin of the universe somewhat, but he says the essential conclusion remains the same. Time did not exist before the Big Bang. Therefore, I think we do have good evidence for the origin of the universe in Big Bang cosmology, and quantum physics does nothing to subvert that conclusion. Indeed, quite the contrary. The Born-Booth-Vilenkin theorem proves that any universe which is expanding on average throughout its history cannot be geodesically complete in the past. That is to say, it has to have a past space-time boundary. And contrary to what Dr. Stenger said, the Born-Booth-Vilenkin theorem is today widely accepted in the physics community, and therefore I don't know of any more plausible model of the origin of the universe than one which says that the universe must have begun to exist. Whether the beginning was singularity or not is immaterial. The point is that it cannot be extended to the infinite past. So the cosmological argument, I think, gives powerful grounds for believing in God's existence. What about the moral argument? Now notice what Dr. Stenger did here was to redefine what is meant by objective. He says objective means most people agree with it. That's not what objective is. That's intersubjective. And I'm talking about whether or not moral values are objective in the sense that they hold and are binding regardless of whether anybody believes in them or not. And I think Dr. Stenger agrees with me that in the absence of God, moral values are not objective in that sense. And that's what the evolution of morality demonstrates and is all about. So what I want to know is, why is Richard Dawkins wrong when he says that on atheism, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. It seems to me that on naturalism, moral values are not objective. They are, as Dr. Stenger says, just the result of governments passing laws, social conventions. And in one nation, you can pass laws to drive on the right-hand side of the street. On another nation, you can drive on the left-hand side of the street, and neither one is objectively right or wrong. They're just social conventions. But the problem is, I don't think that moral values are like that. I think that rape is really wrong. I think that it really is morally wrong to rape a little child. And Dr. Stenger can't make that affirmation consistently on a naturalistic view, because on a naturalistic view, moral values are just the spin-offs of biological and social evolution that have no objective validity. What about the argument from the resurrection of Jesus? Here Dr. Stenger says, well, somebody at that time would have written about Jesus if he had lived and died on the cross. Well, they did. Josephus, the Jewish historian, mentions him. Jesus is mentioned in Jewish, in pagan, and in Christian literature outside the New Testament. But more importantly, he is mentioned in the documents that were later collected together into the New Testament. We have 4 biographies of Jesus of Nazareth. Despite his relative obscurity, we have more information about this man than we do for most major figures of antiquity. And historians have determined that among the facts that belong to the historical Jesus are things like the empty tomb, the origin of the Christian faith, and the disciples' belief in his resurrection. The scholars that Dr. Stenger quoted are in the tiny minority of scholars that deny those 3 facts. The vast majority agree with them, and I've debated those guys that Dr. Stenger talks about, and none of their arguments have been able to hold up. So I think on the basis of the resurrection alone, we have good reasons to think that God has intervened in a public, dramatic way in human history, thereby giving us objective evidence of his existence, just that evidence that Dr. Stenger demands that he provide.
Now, in any debate, the side that has the far tougher job is the side that has the higher burden of proof. Dr. Craig knows this and is very good at trying to cast the burden on his opponents. But by any measure, Dr. Craig is the one who has the greater burden. because he's the one making the more extravagant claim. I claim he can understand everything naturally in terms of matter alone. Dr. Craig proposes that a super being exists of unimagined power and goodness, and I insist that this is unnecessary to understand the world. Now, I don't have to prove that a God was not necessary to create the universe. All I have to do is provide a plausible scenario for a natural origin that is consistent with all existing knowledge. This I have done. I do not have to prove that a God did not design the universe and life and produce the order that exists in the world. All I have to do is show that I have a plausible explanation for how complexity arises naturally from simplicity. This I have done. I do not have to prove that the universe did not have a beginning. I just have to show that we have no scientific or mathematical basis that it did. This I think I have done, even though Dr. Craig quotes some recent papers. I can tell you that that's not a scientific consensus as he claimed it is. I do not have to prove that God did not provide us with our moral sense. I just have to show that we have no reason to assume that humanity is not capable of developing its own objective moral codes. This I think I have done. Sure, the raping of a child is wrong. Raping of anyone is wrong. I know this. I didn't need God to tell me this. I don't know how it came about that I know this. Maybe it came about as a natural development of the human species as we learn to live together. There are many, as I said, there's a whole literature on the subject of the evolution of morals, and it's that literature that Dr. Craig has to answer, not just my weak attempts to justify the idea that we don't need God for morals that we hold. Now, I don't have to prove that the events surrounding the death and supposed resurrection of Jesus, as described in the Bible, did not take place. I just have to show that this is not the consensus of many, if not the majority, of highly qualified biblical scholars. Now, Dr. Craig tells us that, again, we have a disagreement here on a factual matter. I don't know where he does his surveys. Maybe he has some special insight here that I'm not aware of, but all the surveys I've seen indicate that most scholars do not believe that most of the events of the gospel are that accurate, that they're historical. And Bart Ehrman has stated that, as a matter of fact. In fact, let me just quote from Ehrman's debate with Dr. Craig. He said that the Gospels are not historically reliable accounts. The authors were not eyewitnesses. They're Greek-speaking Christians living 35 to 65 years after the events they narrate. The accounts that they narrate are based on oral traditions that were in circulation for decades before anybody started writing them down. Year after year, Christians who were trying to convert others, and they told these stories to convince them that Jesus was raised from the dead. These writers are telling stories that Christians have been telling all these years. Many stories were invented, and most of the stories were changed. For that reason, these accounts are not useful, and we would like to, as useful as we'd like them to be for historical purposes. They're not contemporary, they're not disinterested, and they're not consistent. And Dr. Craig uses the argument of the apostles giving their lives for their beliefs. Well, what about the kamikaze pilots in World War II? They gave their lives for the emperor. That didn't make the emperor God. And in fact, there were a lot of German soldiers who gave their lives to Hitler, for Hitler in World War II. That didn't make Hitler God. So that's a pretty weak argument, it seems to me. Now, I do not have to deny also that many people have what they sincerely believe is is an inner experience of God. All I have to do is argue that this inner experience can all be in their heads. The way to prove that the inner experience is legitimate and not just something in their heads would be, again, for someone to come back with some knowledge that they could not possibly have known. No one has ever done that, just like my argument against revelation. And I think those arguments that I made early in the talk have not been rebutted satisfactorily. Those were factual statements. I think all this is sufficient to defeat Dr. Craig's case. However, I've gone further. While Dr. Craig has the heavy burden of proving God exists, I have accepted the somewhat lighter burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that he does not, since that's really a simpler hypothesis, just taking what we see around us and saying that's all there is, and it agrees with everything we know. I've done this by instituting a criterion called that absence of evidence can be taken as the evidence of absence when the evidence should be there is missing. Now, I've done this by providing several examples where evidence for God, who plays an active role in the universe, should have been discovered by now. Now, Dr. Craig tries to convince us that it's reasonable to believe in the Christian God. Let's see if this is in fact reasonable. This God is supposed to be the creator of the universe with 100 billion galaxies, each containing 100 billion stars. And that's just the universe visible from Earth. According to current cosmology, the largest portion of matter that appeared from the initial Big Bang now lies beyond our horizon. One estimate is that this amounts to 100 orders of magnitude more than we have already within our sights. So our universe is just a grain of sand in the Sahara, and according to current understanding, there may be an endless number of other universes, and the Christian God is supposed to rule over this while at the same time having an intimate relationship with humanity. He sent his only son, who happened to be also himself, to earth to be tortured because our ancestors, Adam and Eve, committed the horrible sin of eating from the tree of knowledge. For some reason, God waited 9 billion years to create us, and so fine-tuned us so that we can only expect to live on this tiny planet, which is doomed to extinction in 1 billion years or so. Now, Dr. Craig calls all that reasonable. I call it preposterous. Thank you.
In my closing statement, I'd like to see who has discharged his burden of proof in the debate tonight. Which of you has been shown to be more reasonable? Has Dr. Stenger been able to show that atheism is true? I don't think he has. In his last speech, he said, I don't have to prove that there is no God. Well, no, he does have to support his premises. His argument, remember, had two premises. Probably if God were to exist, there would be good objective evidence of his existence. And I gave two reasons for thinking that premise to be dubious, neither of which he has addressed in tonight's debate. The second premise was there is no good objective evidence for his existence, and I indicated that God has provided objective evidence of his existence in things like the origin of the universe, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, God's moral law, and so forth. And Dr. Stenger hasn't dealt with those arguments specifically. Remember, 7 out of the 11 observations that he lists in his book, I think, have already been met. So I don't think we've heard a very good case for the non-existence of God tonight, for atheism. What about for theism? How is the evidence shaping up there? First, the ontological argument. Dr. Stenger had no response in his last speech to my rebuttals of his incoherent metaphysical pizza. The fact is that if you believe it's possible that God exists, then God does exist. So do you think it's possible that there's a God? I do, and therefore it follows God exists. Second, the contingency argument. Again, Dr. Stenger has dropped all refutation of this argument. We saw that anything that exists requires some explanation, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. And if the universe is to have an explanation, it must be in a transcendent external personal cause. Thirdly, the cosmological argument for God's existence.